In this example, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the grid system. So we talked about it in the last lesson as well, and because it is such a crucial part of Bootstrap, we're going to be going over it as well again. So here we do have an example. So we notice that when we do cut it short, we do get some white space in there, and it doesn't really look like it's stacking uniformly. So when we're all the way out on a desktop view, we've got some white space in here, and this is not ideal. And this is one of the reasons why you should work with the number 12, because you want to make sure that there's always something filled in. Unless your design calls for this to be different on desktop, to have that kind of chunk sticking out, you want to really make sure that you're getting up to the number 12. So this should be corrected, and it should be an 8. And that allows you to have a full fill of each row, all going all the way down, and that makes for better responsive design and development. So there are also ways to adjust these columns. So if you are working with a different size or a different number of columns, so if you want to work with a base of 17 columns or 16 columns, you can do that, and there is some code on the internet that will walk you through how to set those up. You could also set your own custom columns so that they're a certain width across. But generally, if you're beginning and you're starting out, only look at the 12 columns across. So make sure that everything adds up to 12, and then you're good to go for responsive, and you don't have to really look at that and try to calculate that out, as well as look at, well, you know, what if I get to this size, how is that going to work out? And the other part of this lesson, we want to talk about the rows. So the reason that we're adding in rows here is in order to separate out and group these columns. So we can actually have pretty much the same result if we remove out the rows. So I'm just going to remove those out and just show you what that's going to look like. So when we go and we refresh the page, we see, well, it actually is pretty much the same. It's slightly different. It removed out that gutter that we had, and when we resize it, it looks pretty much the same. We do have a little bit of a gutter there at the side, but overall, generally, it does actually look the same. But the reason that we do use rows is to separate out and group these different columns. So it is a best practice, and it is probably a better idea. So I'm just going to refresh it, and so you can watch and see the difference. There's not going to be much of a difference, just a slight difference on the gutters. So when we do refresh it, it is slightly different, and it always is good practice to be using rows instead of just laying out all the columns by 12. Unless, again, if your design does call for it, but best practice is to have rows to break out the columns into groups of 12. If you're using a grid layout, that's what the rows and the columns are for, so you can quickly make grid layout in Bootstrap. Other benefit of using rows and columns together is that the columns actually default have padding. So if you want to remove out that padding, you could do that, and it would simulate a little bit better of what we were showing you, the rows. But then also you got to remember that the first column in the row and the last column in the row, so if they've got padding and it's removed on the right and left, so it offsets the padding of the row. So this is built in by default within Bootstrap, and at the actual CSS, the Bootstrap CSS, we see that the row has a margin right, -15, margin left, -15, and then we've got all the columns here, so they have padding right, padding left, relative, and all of this is worked out. So here we have the actual excess column widths by percentages, and as I said before, you can create your own. There is some code on the internet to create your own columns, so if you don't want to use 12, but by default this is the easiest way to make Bootstrap grid layout, is just take what they have and just do it 12 by 12. Here we've got the pull and pushes. The thing about it is this is all already calculated for you. We'll be getting into those in a later lesson what the pull and push means, but for now it's just important to know, as well as the offset. It's just important to know that, understand that all of this is within the CSS of Bootstrap, and it is worthwhile to take a look through and look at the CSS itself. Again, to reiterate, so we just have a simplified version here. So what we do have here, we want to make a 3-column design, and we want it to be for desktops to be 3-column, but we've got a lot of stuff here, and we don't have the space to shrink this down on a mobile device, so we wanted that actually to stack vertically. So once it shrinks down below this spacing. So here what we've done is we've given an example of MD4, and we've got columns 1, 2, 3, and we see there that once it gets to this size, it actually adjusts and resizes to stack. And then once we get to the bigger desktop view, we get our 3 columns back again. Difference when you go, so if we change it to SM, we're just going to quickly change that to SM, save that, and refresh it. And you see that on the larger scale on the desktop, nothing has changed. The only time something changes is when we get down to this size. We see that it's still the 3 columns, but once we shrink down under 768, we should see that that's the point where it stacks. So if we don't want this to stack at all, what we can do is we can change that SM to XS and replace that and save that and refresh the page again, and when I refresh it, we see that we get our 3 columns back. So that's essentially how you're going to work with Bootstrap. If you wanted to have a menu running down the side, you could easily do something like this, and you could have your menu running down the side of the page. So when we refresh it, we see that we always do have this part reserved for the menu, the left-hand side part for a menu, and here we could have our content. So you can see how you could style out a page layout. You want to start laying out your website with a header, menu on the left, content there, and footer, and you want to make sure that this is always going to stay static, that this amount of space is always reserved for the menu. This is the way to do that, where you can build it in within Bootstrap. You can go XS12, XS12, so these are always going to be a width of 12, and here you've got your menu as well as content. So you could also further divide these down if the need be, so if you want to make a fat footer, and if you want it to have it, so if you remember that we mentioned earlier that Bootstrap does scale up, so if we wanted to have a width of 12 here, we could use any one of the classes, and that would give us an entire row. So what we're doing here is we're reserving that space of 12. If we want to have a bigger footer, we've got contact information, some links, and then maybe a brand logo or something like that. You can see that we've added that in here, where we've added in SM. So we wanted actually to have 3 different columns within the footer. So what we've done is we've done an SM and created 3 columns within the width of 12. And when we shrink that down, we see that this actually comes to be 3 separate columns, or 3 separate rows. And when you change this to XS, so we're just going to show you, so do you think that there's going to be a difference now that I've changed it to XS? And if you said no, you're correct. Changing this actually doesn't affect, because again, it does scale up from lowest to highest, so it scales up within the classes do scale up. And 12 is always going to be the full size, full width across within a default on Bootstrap. And then you can continue to work within that sizing of 12 if you want to place an additional within your content. If you had 3 columns that you wanted to work with, or let's say you had 2 columns within that content that you wanted to work with, we can just do it that way, and show you that those are the two columns. And now you can begin to see that you've got a layout that's coming out within your content. And now you just would have to style out all the different classes and style out a little bit better. By default, what I'm using is this min height of 150 in my styling, and that's only because I want it to be more visible what the column widths are going to be. So if I do shrink that down, you see it shrinks down as well. So I was just using this for tutorial sake, as well as I'm using the background colors, the alternating background colors within the CSS, so that you can more easily see the different columns that are available. So this was all just for the lesson's sake. So by default, normally you're not including a height unless you want a specified height within your borders. So again, Bootstrap doesn't specify height; it just does width. So if you do want a specific height, or if you're stacking different height objects, if you've got a bunch of images, you've created an image gallery and you're stacking those, you might want to be setting the height for the columns in order to have it stacked properly. Otherwise you might get intermittent stacking depending on the height and the spacing that's being used up. If your stacking ever does go off course, then look at the height and make sure that all your objects within all the items that are available that you're placing within these columns are fitting uniformly within the height of the largest height item within the row. We're going to use what's called a Jumbotron. So Jumbotron is a built-in class within Bootstrap that allows you to show and highlight special information. So a lot of times it's used on a welcome page or your initial launch page, just to highlight some information and get that user attention. You can see here that there's a slight difference in the screen color, so I changed all of these over to white, and we can see here that it's slightly grayer color than the regular white background, and it is styled to be highlighted, so the text is going to have this padding around it. Usually developers will use the H1 tag within it, and then they'll use a paragraph to have some additional text and content there, and it really does look fairly nice. And there's a lot of cases where you just want to have some kind of highlighted content, and that's where you can use the Jumbotron. Again, as with anything in Bootstrap, really easy to add is to class equals Jumbotron, and then that sets up that div class there within Jumbotron. And additionally, I've just added another row, and I've separated out this content into additional row so it's not going to overlap at any point. And what you can do is, again, the responsiveness, shrink it down, and you see how the Jumbotron actually handles the shrinking down, where it shrinks down that padding on the left and right side, but it keeps that text vertically aligned. So if you do have important information, then this is a really good way to present it, and it'll look nice on a small screen as it does on a larger screen. So that's all you have to do, class Jumbotron, and that adds that in to your web content.